Hello, everyone. My name is Karan, and I'm going to be your host for today. Welcome to a very, very special episode of From the Ground Up, a University of Chicago public policy podcast produced at the Harris School of Public Policy. Today, we bring to you a very special conversation from practitioners from both the US and Africa on resources and development pertaining to the African region. This event was hosted in Harris School of Public Policy with Baba Freeman, Peter Chin, Kendall Ananyi, and Dr. Hudson. We really hope you enjoyed this discussion.
My name is Adedapo Aziz, and I'm representing From the Ground Up, a U3CP podcast about the energy industry. We're here to talk about Africa, and I might be a little biased as I am African as we come. But I truly believe that Africa is a continent with immense opportunities and unrealized potentials. See, the energy transition is not the first time that Africa has been the major source of resources or minerals that would be used to transform the world that we would come to live in. However, many argue that Africans have not benefited enough from the resources of Africa. And we hope that this time around, the story can be different. But as we know, as policy ethicists, we know that it can be difficult to do the right thing, even when you have the right intentions. It's important that we strike the balance between getting the resources that we need from Africa, but also doing it in an equitable and sustainable way. Many people disagree on how that should be done. Our panelists today also disagree, and that's why I think this conversation would be very interesting. But before I introduce our moderator and our panelists, I would like to thank our sponsors. The Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast, the International Development and Policy Association, the Military Affiliated Students at Harris, and the Office of Military Affiliated Communities. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to our distinguished moderator and our panelists. Dr. Derrick Hudson is to my right. He's the Director of Natural Resources and Energy Policy Program at the Colorado School of Mines. Dr. Hudson brings a wealth of knowledge in African political economy, international politics, and U.S. foreign policy. Our panelists are Peter Chin, who is to my left, Dr. Freeman, who is joining us online, and Kendall Ananyi, who is also joining us online. Peter Chin is a critical materials subject matter expert and advisor for the Irregular Warfare Center with an illustrious background as a former U.S. Special Operations Command Master instructor and a legacy of mentoring elite U.S. Special Operations Forces. Peter brings a wealth of knowledge to the conversation. Peter advises companies and government agencies on enhancing the circular economy of rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and critical material supply chain management globally. Baba Freeman is an ESG researcher at the Payne Institute of Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Baba's expertise in environmental, social, and governance ESG research offers a unique lens to Africa's complex landscape of sustainable development. His work at the Payne Institute of Public Policy underscores its commitment to understanding and addressing African development's intricate challenges and opportunities. Baba promises to elevate our discussion with his profound insights and a research-driven approach. Kendall Ananyi is a visionary entrepreneur, a fellow Nigerian, so I'm proud he's here, and the founder of TexChange. Kendall embodies the spirit of innovation in Africa's tech landscape. His journey spanning roles with global giants like ExxonMobil, investing in trailblazing startups, and creating TexChange, a startup revolutionizing internet provision in Africa, brings the blend of tech-driven entrepreneurship and a profound understanding of Africa's digital future to our panel. These voices have been carefully chosen to ensure a holistic understanding of our topic today. As we delve into the discussion, I urge you all to be attentive, inquisitive, and reflective on the insights that will be shared. With our introduction in place, it's time to immerse ourselves in this discussion. And I'll honor the floor to Dr. Hudson, who will initiate our panel discussion. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon to all of you, one and all. I really am very honored to be here. Christian Gaona was one of my students in the graduate program a few years back, and he offered me this opportunity to spend some time with you all. So I'm really honored and privileged to be such a fine people who are really interested in thinking about, the challenges and opportunities in security energy to benefit Africa and her people. So I'm going to offer a few comments as a backdrop, and then have each panelist respond first to just to kind of give their overall, based on their expertise and experience, what their hopes are for Africa's development trajectory in the next decade. In fact, I know we all like to be forecasters, but I am thinking a lot about, I'm sure many of you know, the African Union 2063. So we are 100 years past the era of independence, and there are a lot of aspirational goals moving forward to that. But I have here, what are the hopes for Africa's development trajectory in the next decade, and kind of what inspired you all to engage in Africa's development, and what changes have you witnessed over the years. So I want each panelist to do that first, and then I have a question for them specifically around our sub-themes, natural resources and development, overcoming challenges and sustainable development. Time permitting, at the end, before we turn over for a little discussion, I will like each panelist to reflect very intentionally on equity. And so the first initial response for the panelists, I would like to part of the couch comments, maybe 5 to 7 minutes. I'll do a very, very gentle reminder at the 1 minute mark to help keep us on task. What I'm going to do now, though, is give a little bit of a backdrop of a way to think about, where we are in this moment, as was just mentioned. So back in 2016, little band of foreign affairs. And so they had a theme in 2016 called Which World Are We Living In? And the 6 worlds that were featured in the journal were the realist, liberal, Marxist, tribal, tech, and climate. The motivation for this thematic focus was the election of Donald Trump and his signaling of the end of the quote-unquote Wilsonian FDR liberal international order, very, very intentional time in international relations theory and practice. And now with the war in Ukraine, foreign affairs has now focused one of their most recent publications, the one dated back in May and June of this year, the non-aligned, and I really emphasize that, as a shift in our geopolitics. The West, the rest, and the new global disorder. Now, for me, I've been teaching on Africa now for over 20 years. And this is not new to Africans. Africans have always been keenly aware of their position geopolitically. And then historically, especially during the depths of the Cold War, there was a sort of a realization that many countries had to decide which wagon to get into, either the Soviet or the American camp. And then when the Soviet Union imploded, then China ascended on the scene in the late 1990s. But now, where we are, I think, is that Africans are really questioning, along with many others, the need to intersect. That I typically keep recalling in the 91 requirement, sort of was lamenting when many of the former flexible countries were not fully on board with the war in Europe. Because I think that when it began, many African people and societies are keenly aware that the so-called liberal international order has not served African well. In fact, to make very compelling arguments that the legacy of slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, has systematically, actually, well, my colleague here, James Robbins, had did One Nations fail, and cement it what we call an extractive business. So I think we're at a window now where there's so much talent and diversity and skill already on the continent. And more to the point, energy is now increasingly upending geopolitics. I'm actually starting to be able to view, that was his very intentionally, that I think energy is now driving geopolitics. Whereas before, the economy idea was opposite. Because there was only one source of energy that you had to secure, and once you have that, you were good to go. But we are now looking at lots of different kinds of energy. And no one country or sector or entity can capture and control all of it at one time. So what does that mean? That means that we have to really be thinking very intentionally with a lot of you as future policymakers and like all the more broad principles to ensure energy security and maybe will help sort of like people. Diversification, resilience, integration, and transparency. So today's roundtable is an attempt to clarify what those are and how we can move forward. So I'll first start with Peter. Again, the first question is, so based on your experience, and your expertise, what are your hopes around after this development trajectory, what's spending, and what inspiring you to engage your work on the African continent? And then the particular question for you is, how can Africa navigate the complexities of global geopolitics while pursuing its development agenda?
Hope I remember all of those questions. Thank you, Dr. Hudson. Christian. In fact, there, I'd like to thank him for the invite. You left the most important part of my bio out. I did my undergrad at University of Chicago. It was phenomenal to walk the campus yesterday. And just go, oh, that's what I'm going to stay. Oh, that's on the library, the quad. And I'm super excited to be here. Graduated a while ago. Good Lord. It's fine. Take advantage of all of the opportunities that you have while you're here. This is a phenomenal university. I miss it. And this is one of the places on the planet helping to push the world policies forward. I have to give a quick disclaimer that I do not speak on behalf of the U.S. government or the U.S. military. You always have to do that. I work for the Original Warfare Center, whose job is to amplify, eliminate threats, irregular threats, and irregular activities to the nation. So anything really can be on the table, but we bring together U.S. government, U.S. military, interagency, U.S. industry, NGOs, and host nation governments to help solve different problems. In terms of how I got involved with Africa, quite by chance, I've been to 3 different parts of the continent, South Africa and West Africa, 2 or 3 months ago I was in West Africa. It's supposed to go back. That's like a really long story. The potential that I saw was awesome there with the number of unemployed young people. Unemployment, underemployment, that combined with all of the resources that they had, young people, the amount of resources in terms of natural, whether it be oil, gas, metals, and minerals, there was kind of the new oil in many ways. If you look at electric vehicles, if you look at the renewable energy transition, and this is not the first time that the U.S. government, that the Department of Defense has been concerned with critical materials and critical resources. So in 1979, Albert Einstein sent a letter to FDR saying, hey, there's these new developments in nuclear physics. We can release orders of magnitude more energy than we can through conventional explosives. This is released through the fissioning of a particular element called uranium. Uranium is not important until it became important. And where are highest grade ores uranium? They're to be found in the Belgian continent. If you go to, many of you are in Albuquerque, there's a National Nuclear Sciences Museum where they have the original letter, and you can see the Belgian continent down there. The OSS, which is the predecessor of the CIA and Special Forces, was put in charge of securing the uranium and making sure that the Germans didn't get it. Now, if you look at critical materials historically, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and invaded the Dutch East Indies, present world, saying Hitler's Southern Front and Operation Barbarossa was to secure the battlefield oil fields. If you look at SR-71 Blackbird, the most important spy plane, and during the Cold War, it was made of titanium. The CIA was put in charge of creating front companies to purchase that titanium from the former Soviet Union. And we could go on. That first Gulf War started with oil, and now you see these critical resources. There's a global game being played out in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. Everybody's many of these high-end weapon systems, they're constituted some rare earths as well as other elements that are not domestically mined, produced, or manufactured here in the United States. So that's kind of what got me into it. But the African continent, going back to that, the great potential that they have there. My hopes in the next 10 years are that they look at case studies. Who do I want to be? Who do I want to emulate? Singapore had nothing. Dubai is one of the wealthiest places on earth. Actually, all of the oil money is next door in Abu Dhabi. So you look at what you have on hand, you look at your domestic resources and your population as part of that. And your geographic position, Djibouti does not have a lot like that too. They have an American military base and they have a Chinese military base. They're the only country on the planet that has those because of its geostrategic location. So you can look at your position, you can look at your endowment of resources, and just reverse engineer who you want to be. What assets do you have? What can you access internationally? What can you access regionally? What regional blocks should you try to put together with your neighbors? And Africa should be the next Asia, in my opinion. Sure. Yeah, I'm going to hit all.
Yep. Okay. And then I think, well, let me go to Baba. Are you there, Baba?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, good to see you. Let me find you a question. So again, just overall your expertise and background and what has sort of kept you inspired about thinking about Africa and its development. And then your question is the following. As we approach the end of the first 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063, which I made reference to earlier, what are the most promising development practices that you've encountered in Africa, and how have they been implemented? So maybe if you can think of maybe one or two that was during that 10-year time period, and kind of what has been the success or failure of those.
Thank you, Professor. It's my pleasure to see you. I do hope you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes.
Okay, indeed. As a matter of fact, that particular question, I'm not really familiar with the first 10-year implementation plan and all that. But over the period from 2013 to the present time, I'm making a whole series of observations. And I think historically, I try not to pay too much attention to plans and things like that, because I mean, this is we're not going some communist era, Chinese era, great leap forward. The questions and the reality on the ground, they are more complex than anything which can be captured within the 10-year plan. We're dealing with a lot of historical baggage here. And the fact is, any plan that's externally motivated and externally proposed has actually very, very, very little impact on the lives of an average African person. And that's why I do not pay too much attention, to those plans. The constraints on the ground are constraints that have to do with politics and the political economy. And we're talking about a nation a continent of people who are still struggling, to govern themselves in the post-colonial period. And without, political governance, without settling the issue of governance and accountability, there is simply nothing that's going to work the way it's supposed to, because the governments lack legitimacy, the people lack confidence, and everyone is just trying to take care of themselves out there. So I do not really pay too much attention, to external plans. what the continent needs to grapple with are those political questions of how do we govern ourselves. It wasn't so before colonialism. It's been so. It's been 60 years of dysfunction, and everything which has come externally into the continent of Africa, whenever it works, it only benefits just a few people. The majority of the people remain poor or even worse off. So, and that's because all the external ideas do not necessarily take into consideration the political reality of governance and who has what power, who can make what pronunciation, who has what moral and what legal and what traditional authority. I mean, it's dysfunctional, and that's why nothing has worked all these years.
So I'm going to actually offer a follow-up just to underscore. Chris what came in my mind as Baba was speaking. Has anyone in here ever heard of, he's an economist, William Easter? Okay, so I would actually encourage folks to make a mental note for later. William Easterly wrote a book years ago. Well, he has several, but the one that I'm thinking of as Baba was speaking is called The Tyranny of Experts. So I'm supposedly an expert. I have a doctor behind my name, a PhD behind my name. And part of the point that Easterly is making about development is the following. That you have, to Baba's point, you have two types of folks. You have the planners, right? Folks who can methodically, really analytically, policy and roll out very, very methodically how they're going to implement something. And then we have what I call it seekers. And when you're a seeker, to Baba's point, you just have to go, like Peter has, and be on the ground. And it doesn't mean that you don't do the hard work of planning.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that when you go, just kind of step that off to the side a bit and just really observe what is actually going on the ground. Because I am telling you, if you're a former Peace Corps volunteer, one of the great things they've taught us, all the alumni, I'm a Corps Bell PhD, and we have the largest Peace Corps alumni program in the country, the Cloverdale Fellows Program. And those people are really amazing about it in every row because they really know how to just listen to people. I also have a strong background in religion. And I often think of the Mennonite tradition. These folks are historically pacifists, and they often don't do war, but they do peace really well. So a man that I've known for years, Ben Carnes, he can just show up anywhere, and he'll gain the trust of more people. So they have tremendous skills at what I call deep listening. To Pina's point, and you're going to be excited now, which is why maybe I should be a moderator. I should be one of the panelists. Is that Vincent Hardy got his degree here in Chicago. And Vincent Hardy was a Mennonite. And he was the most important civil rights leader no one ever heard of. He was King's confidant. So if you think about it, King was doing all the planning and organizing. And he returned to Vincent to write all of his speeches. Because the point I'm trying to make here is that Vincent lived Martin's art and would know what to write and what phrases to use and so on and so on. So I like the word holistic that you used earlier. That's how we have to really think about development. And I think a lot of it is sometimes overly technocratic. Of more being technocratic, but sometimes I come away and I'm a scientist and someone trained in religion and theology and spirituality. Sometimes a little bit too technocratic. We need to be able to talk across disciplines to each other, the longest point, because this is a Gordian knot of what it means to be ordered. So I just wanted to underscore that comment there. So we're going to move on to Kendall and get you on the table here. So Kendall, if you're there, same thing. I want you to give a brief, what has inspired you to be engaged all these questions around development in Africa. And then the question is, how can Africa navigate the complexities of global geopolitics while pursuing its development agenda?
Hi, everyone. Kendall here. Hope you can hear me.
So I'm an entrepreneur, obviously, which means I'm bullish on Africa. So for me, my hope in the next decade is one of continued growth, resilience, driven by innovation. Tech startups have a big role to play in that. Sustainable practices, not one of those where you get aid, you execute a project, and nothing happens after. And then I envision a continent where technology empowers individuals and communities. And obviously, Africa's unique strengths and challenges are harnessed for sustainable development. I invest in startups. I'm sure you've seen all of the news around all the financing that's come in the last 3 to 4 years into the continent. And so I'm seriously bullish about Africa's progress. One of the things I'm doing is building infrastructure in Africa. Even this year alone, even though there's a downturn in tech industry, we're still deploying CapEx to provide connectivity to folks in Africa, because we've seen that even though we first started with the tier 1 cities, we've seen the impact of providing affordable, unlimited internet to folks. People are no longer just browsing the phone or sending emails. They're using it in their work. They're using it for remote work. They're using it to watch video. And the impact from my company on improving connectivity as we've moved into tier 2 and tier 3 cities, we're seeing people embrace using of internet to teach themselves to do and better their community. Right. So I'm significantly bullish. Over the next decade, we'll see more. I've been fortunate to invest in some companies that have become, for example, Florida Wave, which is a unicorn, which is $1 billion company. And I've seen it start off as a seed stage company and grow to become $1 billion company. I've seen, I was also fortunate to invest in Paystack, which was the first major exit in Nigeria, a $200 million acquisition by Stripe, which is based here in the Bay Area. So I've seen those kind of things, being an early investor in those kind of companies. I've seen what technology can do to improve their lives. And I've also seen what those founders have gone on to do and also help finance other startups by paying it forward. And those startups too are coming up about $100 million companies. So we're seeing the effect of tech in the last couple of years. Sorry, then the second question, can you go over the second question again, sir?
And then, so I think what essentially is how can Africa navigate the complexities of global geopolitics while pursuing its development agenda. So I think what I'm trying to get at here, Kendall, is this notion of this non-aligned paradigm shift I made reference to earlier.
Okay. So global geopolitics, there are a lot of things that are not within the control of the leaders in Africa. I would say two-pronged approach, thinking works in everything you're doing, how you yourself can better yourself as Africa, right? So more of a more balanced, pragmatic foreign policy without leaning too much into it. And then actually looking in what threatening regional cooperation within Africa. So some of the work the African Union is doing, right? Diversifying partnerships with both traditional and emerging. So not leaning only to the US, go east too, right? There's China is growing and there are other people there that you can align with. So just balancing those global powers. Then diplomacy, right? The dialogue, right? Focus on things that are in international engagement with development finance institutions, right? There are a lot of them scattered around the world globally, right? That can help. And then same thing, by looking inwards, by strengthening your regional cooperation, you can then foster economic growth and stability.
All right, thank you. So now it's a quarter till. So I want to ask the panelists a question on equity and justice, as I mentioned earlier, and then I'd like to begin to open up the discussion for questions from you all. So I'd like to ask this question, and I have the three of you respond to that, and then we'll begin to open up the discussion to some other folks in the audience. So the question I have in mind here are what are some of the most significant barriers to achieving equity in development in African countries, and how might they be overcome? So Peter, any just preliminary, just kind of so we think of equity, what is it, maybe perhaps, and then how can we start to really be intentional about addressing them and incorporating them into what we're doing?
I would look at what outcome you want to achieve. And regarding equity and inclusion, what happens if you don't have it? You're going to increase the brain drain in your country. So you're going to lose some of your best young people. You're going to have more social unrest because they're going to feel like They don't have the right opportunity. I'm not part of the right tribe. I'm not part of the right socioeconomic class. And so my own particular potential is not being realized. The full potential of the people, that's one of the things that can lead to the government being toppled. It can lead to riots in the streets. So what outcome do you want to achieve? If you want equity and inclusion, I would reverse engineer from that. Can't really speak to Africa because it's 54 countries. And that's part of the problem with the U.S. government and most people when they do talk about Africa. Like there's so many different cases and each nation is subdivided into sometimes dozens, if not hundreds of ways. So it would be context specific to the country, to the region, to the particular challenge that you're talking about. If you look at Nigeria, so they have a Muslim north, Christian south, but you could further subdivide that. Say, okay, does everyone feel isolated? If not, why? And the point about the Peace Corps being able to speak to people on the ground, that's actually done. Well, you might not believe this, it's very big in special forces. When you hit the ground, you want to hear what the leaders say. That's of utmost importance. We call it ground truth. Whatever you're planning might have been back in the United States, once you go overseas, all right, you always have to adjust. So, yeah, I would say that it's context specific. The different parts of Africa, I can't speak to the continent generally on that particular topic.
But, okay. Well, Kendall, you want to jump in? Any thoughts? Well, I think you might be. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I was signaling that, I think Christian,
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think, that's an excellent question, Professor. Being spiritual people, you and I, we do know that, where there is no justice really, which equity is one of the attributes of justice, no one can really expect, to achieve sustainable development. So Africa is very diverse. All the countries actually, ridiculously diverse. It's incredibly so. And so one of the ways in which inequity rears its head, I'll give maybe like two examples. One is such that, there are some ethnic nationalities, because we have all those ethnic groups, some of which are large enough to be a whole nation by themselves, right? So we have those ethnic nationalities all over within each of those countries in Africa, right? And in some cases, like in Nigeria, a lot of the wealth came from a place in the deep south. And the nationalities that inhabit those areas are not necessarily the most populous, which means they do not have quite as much political power as the economic resource base will indicate. And so for many years, for decades and decades and decades, the people in those oil-producing communities, they were dealt with in such an inequitable manner, in the sense that they had very little control over the way the oil was developed. And it became such an issue because when so much wealth is coming out of somewhere, right, and the people there are not seeing the wealth, and moreover, they're suffering environmental degradation that disrupts their lifestyles and makes them poor in a place where we have billions of dollars, then, that is bad for sustainable development. And what has simply happened in the Niger Delta was this: it was only a matter of time before, a few young guys, a few teenage guys in the early 20s decided to take up arms and say, this is not right. We're not going to do this. We're not going to go hungry, right, in this kind of circumstance. So equity and justice, requires in the African context that, the opinions of different nationalities be part of the discussion in such a way that everybody feels as though they are part of the solution, they're part of the policy design, and everybody has a voice. This brings up equity, in the discussions. Another way this works is that, there's a lot of rural-urban divide as well in many African countries. The intellectuals and the business people that dominate the policy discussion where such do happen, they're really, coastal urban dwellers. And all that, basically the policies favor them when they work. Now, imagine we're living in a country where the farms are in the rural areas, as they often are, right? But, nobody has incorporated the opinions and the thoughts and the aspirations and the capabilities of the rural areas in the policies of the countries. So what happens? We're seeing what we're seeing now, which is that because of a lack of political power, there's been very little to no investment in rural agriculture, which would have actually fed the nations, right? And instead, the elite and the intellectuals who live in the cities, the policies they have favor importation of agricultural products that could have been produced up, further inland, would have created employment for people, would have taken away poverty, would have developed the hinterlands, right? And at the same time, if a nation is able to produce its own food as opposed to importing it, you can imagine what that will do for the balance of payments. You can imagine what it will do for the saving rate. You can imagine what it will do for industrialization and all that stuff. So that's another way. That rural-urban divide is also another way in which equity, or the inequity, has reared its head. And in both instances I just gave, you can tell that they're totally detrimental to any kind of sustained development in any country. And that's just for the lack of this very simple principle of equity and justice. So it's a developmental, it's a force multiplier, as Colin Powell would have said.
Thank you very much, Baba. And then I just might quickly add to that. I teach a course at School of Mines, and it's required of every freshman, called Nature and Human Values. And I do a whole conversation on moral psychology and thinking about political climate. But I start out, to Baba's point, asking students, and I'm just trying to give you kind of like practical takeaways. When do issues of equity and justice need to start to show up when you're thinking about research and development and policy? Does it start in the R&D phase, or does it show up toward when you're getting ready to roll out something, implement? So I think what I'm trying to get at here, I'm hoping more and more of us begin to realize, I would argue, it should start as soon as possible. So I think I teach political risk. So what often happens is that quote unquote elites or others will say, well, issues of ethics are important, but they're not incorporated in any sort of systematic way in either curriculum or when we're thinking through policy. So what I'm trying to really underscore is the importance to integrate those kinds of questions when you're thinking about policy. They should be happening at the same time. Because what will invariably happen, I have found, is that they will be sidebarred. And they keep getting sidebarred. Well, someone else will take care of it. Well, surely someone else has thought about that. So that's a really, really important thing I really try to hammer home when I'm sort of thinking about ethics, equity, and so on. So I just wanted to underscore what Baba just said there just now. I noticed that we're only 5 minutes till. I want to see if you get a couple of questions from the audience. But Kendall, did you have anything further you wanted to add?
Okay, just quickly, because I know we don't have time. So for me, achieving equity, one of them is working on the infrastructure deficit that we have in the continent, and then access to education and healthcare. Education is very important, right? That helps with empowering women. That helps with prioritizing girls' access to education. And we can do this by policy reform, which is part of what we're trying to talk about today. More investments in social infrastructure, which is kind of what I'm doing with my company. And then targeted interventions. So for one of the examples, you see the widespread adoption of mobile money. We can look at initiatives like microfinance program. We can look at community-driven development projects, right? Working more with some of the development finance institutions to have sustainable projects on ground. And obviously the development agencies, I'm working one of them to provide access to small businesses and in the semi-peri-urban parts of Nigeria, and also expanding outside of Nigeria too. Thank you. Short answer.
Okay. So any comment or questions from our audience with our last 4 or 5 minutes? Oh, wow. Okay. How about you, sir? Yes.
So I have 2 questions. My name is Manda. I'm originally from the DRC. And so I really appreciated the comment on the 1,000 convoys history with the U.S. military. So my first question is, what is the U.S. government doing to rectify the historically aggressive approaches taken to maintain control of critical minerals on the continent to ensure mutually beneficial partnership between South and South countries? And then the second question is, there is a current dilemma that exists as a result of increase in energy, whereby African countries are being pressured to develop their economies using sustainable energy resources, despite only contributing less than 4% of CO2 emissions. So I'm just curious about what people think in terms of what the pressure should be or how African countries should go about developing economies.
Number 2, the Western nations are hypocritical with that. Or what am I supposed to do? I could more address the first one. So there are different parts of the U.S. government, including the Department of Labor, that are looking at, say, Chinese artisanal mines or DRC artisanal mines and trying to lift the standards and putting pressure on companies so that they source their metals responsibly. I believe some of the car companies are involved with this as well. Where did you get that cobalt? Where did you get the tin? Where did you get the tantalum from? So they are looking at it from that point of view because they don't want it coming back. There's ESG standards, and I know some people it's good, some people it's a dirty word, but you should responsibly source wherever you get these particular minerals and metals from. I'm going to cut it short. So other questions?
Well, thank you for being here. So Baba spoke about what is required, which is like governance and accountability. I was wondering if you all could shed light on how do you specifically achieve this? If, for example, if I look at the case of South Sudan, very oil-rich country, more than 2/3 of the population are fragile, and the incentives for leaders to reform just aren't there. So realistically, how can this happen? If you could shed light on them.
The very quick answer was I have a book on South Sudan. The quick answer is that we first have to have infrastructure and we have to have a constitution. So, I met Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, and they want to have elections. So the reason why I'm smiling is if they hold elections, my worry will be what? If it's not going the way either one of them wants it to go, they'll say it's rigged. They'll say it's what have you. So I think it's just really important for us in the West. We have to just say it would just seem that the leaders need to come to a point to where they're going to decide to really hold each other accountable. But we can't shoehorn it. That's why I made my comments earlier about the Wilsonian order in me. Because we can't demand it. We just have to simply say, it just seems that some sort of a framework has to be put into place by the people, because people have to see it as legitimate. If they do not, it's invariably going to fall apart, right? So that's not a really easy way to proceed, but until we have that and infrastructure, these loftier, we will call it that, conversations about development are not going to happen. That's a pretty tough answer, but that would be my quick response to that question. It's a very important question, and we can talk more later about that, for sure. Yes.
Yes, I had a question specifically. So with like the envoy of the State Department to the Great Lakes region, what does that person do in terms of like our dialogue in the Great Lakes? Oh, that's an amazing question, actually. And should the State Department be doing more in terms of how they, like, for example, like diplomatic tools, instead of directly military channels? Can I jump in very briefly?
You go ahead, Robert.
Okay, part of the challenge of dealing with that part of the world is that a lot of the externally motivated interventions are bound to fail. Why? Because they try to impose a certain kind of order that is not borne out by the reality on the ground. And that's why Western diplomacy, should be actually, in my opinion, something of a last resort. See what happened in Sudan, where a lot of diplomacy, was put in place. Western countries did the best they could to bring about peace. But the reality on the ground was that there were two armies in the same space, and two armies never occupy the same space. It's only a matter of time before war happens, right? But over the years of diplomacy, people peppered over that very simple fact as though it didn't exist. And they try to come up with other arrangements. Oh, well, we'll bless your democracy if you recognize Israel, which ended up undermining, some of the people who were in favor of democracy in Sudan. So I will treat, diplomacy, I'll try to embed it within the context of what is real. Otherwise, we run the risk of prolonging wars that should come to an end fast, or actually making things worse.
It will do maybe one more, and then we can hand it on watching our time. How about you, sir, in the back?
Yeah, I just want to share Nad Bank's gratitude for the expertise that you all share. I'm a PhD student. I'm super interested in the Black radical tradition. And this is sort of just, I guess, like a personal view of like a model throughout history then they can speak to a leader of Africa that is, practiced anti-colonialism. They created, a structure of self-determination, politically, culturally, socially. Like there was one model of government and leadership throughout this large tapestry, especially in the last 60 years or so. What would you speak of and why?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part of the question?
A leader, like a model leader and a model government within the last 60, 70 years.
Real quickly.
Yeah.
Why does it have to be African? I would point to Singapore, which is basically, if you've been there, it's more advanced than the US. It's cleaner, it's more organized. I would pick them as a model. Lee Kuan Yew, what he did, they had no resources whatsoever. And many luminaries from his foreign policy would go to him for advice just because of how he organized and sewed all the different ethnic groups together, how he turned it into a city state. Again, it's a city state, so it's going to be different from others. But it doesn't have to be, I would say, why does it have to be African? You can expand your aperture into other regions. Say, that guy's a model. He might not be from my continent, but he has things I can learn from. Use the case study method. Who was executing a program that I admire? And let me emulate them.
Yeah, if I could just follow up quickly, I can't think of anyone like a person, but I think of one of my former mentors, Ali Mazrui. He was from Kenya, and he talks about ethnic proof versus ethnic prone. What he means is, if you can find people who have been able to fashion their societies to be ethnically proof, meaning like in Ghana, they intentionally rotate when they have elections every so many years. They actually follow the mother's line. So my point is, they have found out a way to incorporate all of the traditional practices into a modern political system. So his point is, this could be a model of an ethnic proof society, whereas South Sudan is ethnically prone. So they're given to factionalism. They play on the resource purse. So to Simon's point, that's why we have to look at each country specifically. We don't have time. We have time already. We could just have one talk just on Ghana, just on Djibouti, and go through all 54, because they're all going to be a little bit different. Like in Kenya, where he's from, the problem in Kenya is that on the coast, people on the coast have different attitudes about the country than folks who live inland or landlocked. So another dynamic you keep in mind.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just jump in on that. In the little time we have, there is no continent like Africa. The colonial experience left the continent, with a design to fail. Let me tell you what I mean. We talk about the ethnic diversity in all those African countries. It so happens that for the last 1,000 years of European history, Europeans were forming nation states that tracked the boundaries of the ethnic nationalities. And that's why when you go to Germany, it's German people who live there. And in France, it's French. And in Italy, it's Italians and Sicilians, like to call themselves. Africa is the only place where the very thing the Europeans were running away from was what was implemented, which was to put all these ethnic nationalities in arbitrary national borders that did not reflect either geographical boundaries or ethnic boundaries. And almost every problem that the continent has had since then has been because of this design to fail, that people put a design in place that they were fleeing from. And just to buttress the point, you realize that in this century, and perhaps even so, more so since the end of the Second World War, every country which has achieved advanced development has been a nation or a country that is dominated by one ethnic group, and almost 100%. Japan, South Korea, China, even Singapore is a Chinese city-state, right? There has been no country, right, that has been able to use democracy, right, in a multi-ethnic setup to achieve development. It just hasn't happened before. And so that's where I'm going to live it, because I do have to live.
Maybe one more, and then Bob needs to leave, and make sure we get to a round of applause. Yes, one more.
If I may, on continuing the point of there was conversations regarding conflict parts of Middle East, and I read a paper comparing Africa to Middle East. if I may, both come from like ethnically tribal society. Both were colonially ruled. Both have orthodox religious norms and systems. And I was talking to a couple of my African friends from different parts of Africa, and everyone talked about a similar problem of corruption as well, which is also very existent in the Middle East as well. So what is, if I may, like both come from the similar roots and similar systems, but there's a major difference in development in both the region. And if I may also point out, there are a lot of differences in Middle Eastern countries as well, on the terms of ethnicities and religious issues as well. So how did both the parts of both very similar structures go in like two different directions, if I may ask?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
It's actually quite clear if we have time.
Yeah, we're time. Go ahead, Bob.
Because both, if we do comparative analysis, we realize that actually the similarity is not that great. It's really not that, they're not that similar, right? If we look at Indonesia, which is ethnically complex, but not to the degree that Africa is, when corruption happens in a place like Indonesia, it happens within the context of, well, this is still our country. I'm going to steal money, but I'm going to use it to like build a factory, give my son a big contract to build a road, right? In Africa, because of the ethnic diversity, nobody believes that the nation belongs to them. So corruption takes the form of sabotage. I will take the money and I'm going to move it to a Swiss bank. It's people like Kendall who are trying to change the narrative now, say, you know what, this is where we come from. Somebody has to invest. We can't all flee or sabotage the nation. But I'd like to say people like Kendall, there are still so few. There are so few that we know them. We can actually number them because there's so few of them. So just to answer the gentleman's question, if we do comparative assessment, we realize that the African context is totally different than what you have in the Middle East, where at least there's a common language called Arabic.
Yeah, you need others. Well, and that's, I could send, you want to,
I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. It is very diverse. And your point about Singapore, it's not really a Chinese city-state. It is very diverse. And does anyone here better? Okay. Can you tell me how diverse Singapore is, or if it's the Chinese?
Lot of South Asian population as well has explored like cities and like areas with there's Chinese population, there's South Asian population, there's Southeast Asian population. So I feel it's both areas of Middle East and Singapore have a very diverse system in place. But why?
Ground truth. When you go somewhere, you're going to change your perception. So
yeah, so the seeker and planner idea. Yeah, I think we are. All right. You can come back up. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I want to say thank you very much for coming today. I'm my first guest in here, and I'm very excited that this happens. And I hope in the next 2 years we can have more and more of this, because the truth is Africa is a continent that has to be reckoned with. And it's not just about the energy transition, but also the human capital in this continent. And we have to have more of these conversations, and we have to have more disagreements like Baba and Peter has had. So again, I just want to say thank you, and thank you to our panelists, our moderator today. We are very lucky that we had you.
We really hope you enjoyed that discussion. Now with us in the studio are Christian Guyona.
Howdy.
Adidapo Aziz.
Hello.
And myself, Karan Kapoor. All right. So Christian, what did you think about the entire conversation that just took place?
Thanks, Karan. I really enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was pretty insightful to get a multitude of perspectives from all of the different panelists with their various backgrounds. What I most enjoyed was the debate between Baba and Peter. They went at it for a little bit during the debate, and I think there were some interesting things that were said, some fact checking, and that's what we wanted here from this episode, from this podcast episode, for these different perspectives to collide and for the speakers to defend their positions in front of our students in the audience.
Dapo, what did you think so, now that you moderated the event as well?
Maybe I'm a little biased since I moderated the event, but I think what really resonated with me was the idea that it is important that the West and other partners of Africa realize that, the African continent is not one and the same, that the different parts of Africa with different economic makeup, different political, economic realities that we have to acknowledge. And even though our guests disagree, they all agree that that is, in fact, the truth. So what's important now is how do we do that going forward? Yeah, so I think what matters at this point is, as the mineral resources become more important and things get a little more complicated as the race to get those minerals from Africa heats up, it's important to make sure that it is done in a equitable, sustainable way, like I said in my introduction, but it must be done knowing the realities of the people in Africa. That is what the United States and other countries have gotten wrong for a long time. And we hope that it'll be different this time around. That's why we're having this discussion. That's why we continue to have this discussion so that we can do better in our partnerships with African countries with the uniqueness.
I think for me also, something that particularly stood out was the fact that all the panelists agree that we need to see Africa as 54 independent countries and different diverse communities and culture in them, rather than putting together Africa as a single unit. So the contextualization of policy as well as implementation thereof is extremely, extremely important. And that was something that I found particularly interesting. The other thing that stood out for me was how I think Dr. Hudson mentioned this, that earlier it was geopolitics that was driving energy. Now it is energy and resources that are essential to produce that energy is driving geopolitics. That places Africa and African countries in a position that needs to be leveraged and can be particularly leveraged for the future, because Africa is immensely resource rich. There are technologies, there are facilitators. However, like all the panelists remarked, that there are challenges. So it would be pretty interesting to see how the scenario unfolds in the coming decade or so.
Yeah, I really appreciated that description of the continent and the unique 54 countries. I got a chance to talk to Dr. Hudson and Peter afterwards at the event and today even following the event. And both gentlemen agreed that with all 54 countries in Africa, there is a uniqueness. However, there has to be some sort of unifying idea to bring together those 54 countries to leverage the energy and the natural resources that they have, as it is crucial to the current situation globally, the global competition, to be candid, between the United States and China and their allies, as they depend on natural resources and energy to develop their technologies or their renewable energy resources or their EVs, and irrespective of geography.
Yeah, I've always said to people who talk to me about this topic that at the end of the day, when it comes to Africa doing business with the rest of the world, Africa is always many times on the weaker side, and Africa is much stronger when African countries can come together as a unifying force in partnership with the rest of the world. But again, that is very difficult to do because of how different African countries are and what their goals are. But around the world, we have seen that, regions are able to make immense strides, are able to do so because they're able to come together in partnership. And I'm not saying that it necessarily has to be a cartel, but there has to be some kind of collaboration that can strengthen Africa's bargaining power with other regions and other countries around the world.
Yeah, that was actually today. Dr. Hudson and Dapo here were walking around campus and we were talking about just that. We were actually talking about looking at different continents and their inner struggles as an example or lessons learned to meet the challenges and the inner turmoil among African countries. For example, Western Europe and Eastern Europe, they are all individual countries, and constantly they have had turmoil between each other, leading us into two world wars. and they're still fighting. Look what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. Look at how energy and resources are being leveraged from Germany to Ukraine to the Eastern Bloc and Russia here. We can use energy and natural resources as either a tool of diplomacy or a weapon of war. Same with what happened in the World War with the Pacific Campaign and oil in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But you look at those countries and, in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe, they've come together at times, despite their differences, despite different cultures and different languages from each country, different ethnicities and different dialects. So what I'm getting at is the countries in Europe, despite their differences, despite 2 world wars, despite an ongoing war in Eastern Europe, and different dialects, different languages, different foods, different cultures, and a long history of infighting among these groups, these tribes, if you will, these different ethnic groups. After a while, they've come together to form the United Nations, to form the European Union, to have a governing body, an international governing body among themselves to work out disputes, to protect each other in the face of adversaries that mean to do harm. So I think those are some lessons to take away there. And the idea, I think, and what I was talking to Dapo and Dr. Hudson about on our walk around campus was the idea is a very old one, but that's still prevailing in, with varying levels and perspectives of what we believe, but that is the idea that unites us together. So what is the idea? What is the idea for the 54 countries in Africa to come together as a continent, for the African Union, if you will?
I would say that this is a topic that's very embedded in Pan-Africanism, which is a lot of scholars, a lot of, freedom fighters have tried to create that unifying identity in Africa that could help propel Africa economically. But I think the problem with the way people go about Pan-Africanism, and maybe why it has not been successful so far, is that it's heavily dependent on Western influence in Africa, and that can create a unifying identity that can really bring Africa together, but it has not been strong enough. It is Africa's biggest problem, and one of our biggest problems, but it has not been strong enough to bring African countries together to work together. I think it should be a part of it. We don't have to, agree. We don't have to be friends all the time to be able to come together and compete with the rest of the world. I think if we realize the economical advantage of coming together and really keep it at that, we don't need to, like Kristen mentioned, Eastern Europe, they're not always friends, but for economic reasons, they can come together and know that, within the context of our economies, we have to work together. And I think that's what should be expected of African countries. And the idea that we are different in many ways should not be a reason to stop that collaboration that must happen. I genuinely believe that this is another opportunity that African countries have, and we must not throw it away as we have done in the past.
I think what I believe is the tools for collective identity and collective front exist for Africa. I think the challenge particularly lies where the individual units, the individual countries are struggling among within themselves to try and achieve political stability. So I think it's going to be extremely interesting to see how this collective representation of the African countries through the African Union manages to solve for the political stability problem while respecting the sovereignty of those countries, because that's also something that is extremely, extremely important. And yes, in my opinion, that for me would be something that I am hoping that the countries are able to solve it together. Okay, so with this, we come to the close of this podcast. Thank you so very much for joining in, tuning in, and supporting us all the way. We really hope that you enjoyed the discussion. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot to unpack. So if you have any questions, any suggestions, or any comments whatsoever, feel free to write to us at uc3p@gmail.com. So this is Karan Kapoor, Christian Gaona, and Adida Abu Aziz signing off, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.